Fat Moose Comics, established in 1982, is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Led by current owner Sean Hendricks, Moose has that rare, old-school comic shop feel and camaraderie, yet also remains a welcoming space for new fans. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you are in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. My love of the TV series Smallville is well documented, and there's one rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring great insight, passion, and humor to each and every episode. And the podcast continues with more great Smallville and Superman talk now that their series rewatch has concluded. Listen wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On To banner, including Arrow, Star Wars, and more. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to deliver justice for Pete Ross, Clark Kent's forgotten best friend, is first-time guest, Martin Gray. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Anthony. What a treat to be on one of my favorite shows.
No, I appreciate it. I appreciate your support. We've been talking online for a while. I'm so happy to have you here. And this is an episode that started somewhat tongue-in-cheek, started as a little bit of a running gag on the show, but then it morphed into a rallying cry, a promise that we are finally delivering on here. Before we get into Pete Ross, do you want to tell folks about your comic book review blog?
Yes, I do every week, 2 or 3 reviews, usually mostly DC, at a place called Too Dangerous for a Girl. Now, the title comes from an early DC Adventure Comics Legion story in which Brainiac 5 says to Saturn Girl, "You can't go on this mission, it's too dangerous for a girl." But if people don't know the reference, even though it's on the blog, it sounds like I'm the most terrible sexist. So quite a lot of the time now when I'm tweeting about it, I'll just say, "Review it too dangerous, ... and hope for the best." But yeah, I do reviews, people get some nice chats back from people. And I started doing it basically because the letter calls pretty much disappeared from DC Comics, and the DC message boards went down for years. And even now, I think there's a Discord board, but I can't get my head around Discord for some reason. Is that a very, very old man thing?
Honestly, I feel the same. So if it is, then I'm an old man too, which might be true.
I think it's just because Discord's just a bit of a strange one. But yeah, I mean, it's a great way just to read the comics and put a few thoughts down and have some fun. It just adds extra value to the comics for me.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that you do it. I enjoy reading your reviews. Most recently, I read your review for Action Comics 1088, written by Mark Waid, which featured none other than Pete Ross, the subject of our discussion. So I'll include the link to your blog in the show notes, and I hope people will check it out. So if you'll indulge me for just a moment here, I will share my Pete Ross fan journey, so to speak, and kind of explain why it is that we're doing this episode. And for people who've been following along, this won't come as a surprise, but for anyone who might be new, kind of lay this out. So growing up in the post-crisis triangle era of Superman comics, my view of Pete Ross was he was Clark's childhood friend who, unlike Lana, did not know the secret. They grew up. He became Lana's husband, father of Clark Peter Ross. He was a one-time senator, went on to become vice president to President Luthor, briefly served as president himself after Lex went down in Public Enemies, and right before Infinite Crisis was framed by the villain Ruin. And from the post-Infinite Crisis landscape forward, he's appeared here and there, but he's been largely, I think this is fair to say, largely MIA. And in terms of multimedia adaptations, his most prominent spot, of course, was on my beloved Smallville, where Pete Ross was a supporting character for the first 3 seasons. But even there, and we'll talk about this more, I don't think the show, as much as I love it, was ever really built to serve that character. So all to say that for quite some time, I didn't give a ton of thought to the character of Pete Ross. And I had what turned out to be a fairly limited view and perspective on this character and his value and his history in the larger mythology. And then last year we did our whole run of Superboy episodes, and I came to find out that in the Silver and Bronze Ages, and especially in that Silver Age, he was this silent, noble guardian and protector of Clark's secret. He knew Clark was Superboy and didn't tell a soul, including Clark himself. And so I came away from that journey saying to myself, man, arguably from the Bronze Age forward, and definitely in the post-crisis landscape, this is a character who has been neglected at best and at times mistreated at worst. And I just felt like we had to speak up for the character of Pete Ross, lay out his history, kind of answer some central questions about what role he can and should serve and what place there is for him. So that's kind of my side of this and what I went into this episode with in my mind. So let me toss it to you now. Talk to me about your history, your experience with Pete Ross.
Yeah, I mean, to put it politely, to put it kindly to myself, I'm a little bit older than yourself. So I came across Pete Ross. Firstly, I came across him in the Bronze Age, but I was reading Silver Age comics because back in the olden days of the early 70s, when I was about 8-year-old, it was perfectly acceptable for kids to babysit the neighbor's children because you could just, run across the street if there was a problem with, get your mum and dad. And for my trouble, and there wasn't any trouble, I would get 50p, a whole bunch of chocolate bars, and about 50 to 100 comics every time from the Lady Lynette's brother's old comics collection. I don't know whether he knew she was giving them away, but she was giving them away to me every week. And I was reading stories of Superboy and Adventure Comics and Superboy from about 1960 to about 1965. And in there, Pete Ross would pop up regularly. And pretty much every time he was there, you would get the famous panel of Pete Ross and the camping trip. I mean, should we tell anybody who doesn't know about that what went on there?
Sure, and I'll let you do the honors. All I will say is that panel got repeated / remembered so many times. If you ever wanted to make a drinking game for yourself and go through all those pre-crisis comics and take a shot every time Pete Ross recalls this moment, I mean, you will be wasted. It's hilarious how many times we revisit that moment, but I understand why. But yes, please explain for our audience.
Yeah. I mean, it was his second appearance. I mean, I think we'll probably be talking about his first appearance a bit later. But in his second appearance, he goes on a camping trip with Clark Kent because he's become Clark's best pal, and he wakes up in the middle of the night in a thunderstorm, and the crack wakes him. The lightning flash illuminates outside the tent, and he sees Clark there changing into Superboy. And whereas most of us would probably gasp or shout out loud or go, Clark, or whatever, Pete kept it to himself and then dedicated himself to protecting Superboy's secret identity. But he didn't tell Superboy he was doing that because he didn't want to be any kind of a burden. And he went so far as to carry around in his school bag a Superboy costume and a Superboy face mask, which don't know where he got that from. Maybe they sold it in the Kent store. And for years, he would just go out of his way to give Superboy an opportunity or give Clark an opportunity to run off and change it to Superboy, distracting Lana Lang by throwing himself into a river or whatever. And that was his shtick. He was a great friend. And it was decades in comic book time and in Superman's own lifetime before he knew about it. So yeah, noble is the word.
Yeah, absolutely. I just came away from this whole journey really appreciating the character of Pete Ross a lot more than I ever had before. I want to say at the outset here that as much as we're here to deliver justice for Pete Ross, in fairness, right, we are now at a point, as of this recording in 2025, where it's now once again been established that Clark operated as Superboy before becoming Superman. And this is the ongoing storyline in Action Comics written by Mark Waid. And over this past year, I had both Mark Waid as well as group editor Paul Kaminsky on this podcast. And I talked to both of them about Pete Ross, and both of them shared an appreciation for Pete. So I say that just for the record, so everybody knows, there's work going on right now on the DC front with this character. So it's not like he's being neglected at this exact moment in time. But I still felt like this episode we were justified in doing this because it has been such a long period where I don't think they've quite known what to do with him. And when I say they, like, that's kind of the other aspect of this. It's no secret, right? I wasn't the biggest fan of the Brian Michael Bendis run on the Superman titles. And there are certain really specific things that I can point to there and say, oh man, Bendis, why did he do that? With Pete Ross, it's one of those things where we're talking about decades worth of material here. Like, so I'm not pinning this on any one creator or editor or anything like that. It just feels like collectively, and even beyond the comics as well, because we'll extend this to the adaptations too. It just feels like collectively across decades, people haven't quite known what to do with this character. And I do want to kind of run through key moments in his pre and post crisis history, and we'll do that. But I also don't want us to feel so confined to that chronological format here. So we can jump around. And I think this is a good opportunity to sort of pose one of our central questions, and we can answer it now, or we can answer it in part and circle back to it later. But I want to put it out there. And I really welcome your thoughts on this, because this is something I've been pondering a lot, which is, we're here to deliver justice for Pete. It's like, what role can Pete Ross serve? What role should Pete Ross serve? Especially if we're talking about the adult Clark story. Because I think if we're talking about the Smallville days, I think we've seen a lane that character can occupy very, very effectively. Obviously, that goes away when we're talking about instances like the John Byrne reboot, where we're stripped down a lot of that portion of the story, right? But generally speaking, and we're seeing this play out in the pages of Action Comics right now, and it's a great echo of what we saw before. If you're really delving into those Smallville days, we see a space that Pete can occupy. But when we're talking about kind of adult Clark.
Well, for one thing, I mean, given that they say nowadays that pretty much everything in continuity ever is in play if they want to use it, going back to Pete Ross's first ever story, he was introduced as a boy whose two hobbies were acting and sleuthing. He came from a long line of policemen and detectives, we were told. And in that first story, Superboy was worried to death that Pete was busy collecting evidence on him to try and prove his secret identity. And I would love to see him maybe, be in the Metropolis Police, not necessarily in the super crimes department with Maggie Sawyer, but he could be a police detective that's an occasional contact. But more than that, I would just like to see him as a pal, Clark's drinking buddy, someone that does know his identity, and Clark could unload to him in things that he couldn't necessarily unload to Lois. Because yes, he was Clark Kent's best friend in the olden days, but he wasn't really. I mean, Superboy would sometimes say my best friend Pete Ross, but he wasn't really, because Superboy didn't feel able to be open with him, which meant Superboy couldn't get Pete Ross's counsel. And whereas they could spend time together in civvies, it was a shame that they couldn't have the full relationship. And I think that given that so little was done with Pete Ross over the years as an adult, they could do anything the heck they like. And again, it'll come out throughout the podcast. He's basically been treated continually in various continuities as the sad sack of the Superman family when he's even there. So I certainly could see him play Paul. But yes, as an active member of the Metropolis useful citizen community, great. But just to be a mate, because Clark Kent hasn't got a mate outside of work, really. They're all superheroes, or they're all people who work for the Daily Planet, seems to be. I mean, what do you reckon yourself?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was one of the things I was so struck by in reading Pete's first appearance in Superboy 86 from 1961, that, he has this acting hobby and he's part of the drama club, but he's also this amateur sleuth. And he talks about how, yes, he comes from this long line of detectives. He even says his father works in the police lab, although in subsequent issues, his father's an engineer. So I don't know if they 100% line up, but maybe we can massage that a little bit. But him having these dual interests in acting and being a detective, yeah, arguably one or both could lend themselves to sort of a present for him in Clark/Superman's life in Metropolis. I guess I've landed on the opposite side where in my mind, I feel like there's a place for him in present day Smallville. Now, this gets a little tricky because we only spend so much time there, so this might be somewhat limiting. But, and I've quoted him so many times, he's probably tired of hearing this, but our pal Tyler Patrick from the Krypton Report, when he joined me a while back and we went through Superman for all seasons, and obviously there are references to It's a Wonderful Life in For All Seasons. You have Pete coming in and rubbing the elephant head and wishing for $1 million and all of that. So the references are there. But I think it was Tyler who first said he's like the George Bailey of Smallville. And that idea has stuck with me. I've not been able to shake that idea. And certainly in For All Seasons, Pete is the one with this intense desire, especially in that early issue, to leave Smallville, to shake the crummy dust of this town off my, right? Just like George Bailey in It's Wonderful.
It's absolutely blatant. I mean, I was ashamed when I heard you mention that on the show, and I thought, oh my word! I went back and had a look, and it's like I totally missed that. What a dumb cop,
It's we all have moments like that where all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, it's right there, right? Because we're viewing it through a certain Superman lens and everything. But yeah. When Tyler and I were talking about that, it just like clicked into place. It's like, yeah, he's the guy. He's the George Bailey, the one who wants to go off and have these grand adventures. And in the pages of For All Seasons in particular, we don't really spend a ton of time with Pete. We don't know exactly what it is that keeps him there per se, but when when Clark and Lana return and they all go back to the general store, I think it's in the fourth issue. And Clark in particular is really at a crossroads, not sure where to go. And Pete, he's frustrated. He's like, you guys left and you came back here and you don't even realize, right? Like, what's wrong with that? He's so frustrated. We don't really get to see Pete come out the other side of that in that particular story, but I feel like we can sort of imagine him a la George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, coming to terms with his place and his role in that town. And we do have visits to Smallville all the time, and it's normally framed around Clark visiting his parents, and we love that. I don't want to sacrifice that. But I feel like there could be a place for Pete there as the mayor, so to speak, literally or figuratively, of Smallville. Like, he's kind of the town, like the representation of the town of Smallville. Like, he should be the guy. If trouble is bearing down on them, yes, Clark's going to check in on the Kents, but then he's going to go confer with Pete and they're going to make a plan. Like, he should be the guy. That's kind of what I have in my head.
That's a better idea than mine, Anthony. That would be wonderful because he could be a friend to the Kents. And I mean, we have seen him in modern continuities again because they don't really set anything firmly down. In one comic, he might be the teacher at the Smallville High. In another comic, he's running the general store. But it's like the Daily Planet Globe. Every time you see it, it's different. If they would just send one editorial memo and say, this is what the Globe looks like, this is what Pete Ross does, slot him into your stories. That's an excellent idea because he does go back to Smallville so often these days. We could get some nice scenes, and it would be so wonderful. I mean, for one thing, there's a conversation to be had about how he's feeling about Lana these days, having married John Henry, because in that Summer of Superman issue where they get married and he's got a silent couple of panels and he's sitting at the wedding with presumably Clark/Buster, and the kid looks like him in trouble because dummy. It's very weird. Lana doesn't give a single thought to Pete. There's no mention of Pete, no mention of the kid. I mean, it seems that the marriage to Lana is back in continuity. I think it went away in the New 52. Seems that it's back, but it's like, yeah, so if he was slotted into Smallville in a decent position, as you suggest, we could have all sorts of interesting conversations and happenstances. Good man.
Well, that's right. And yes, we had talked briefly on the show, and you and I had talked off mic about that Summer of Superman special and that wedding between Lana and John Henry. And yeah, you see Pete Ross there with presumably Clark Peter Ross, the son of Pete and Lana, who we haven't seen in many, many years in continuity, to the point where I honestly didn't think the kid was still in continuity. And I think he probably really wasn't. But to my earlier point, I think we're seeing from the current editorial leadership and the creators on the books that there is this effort to harken back to something. The fact that we got Lana Luthor, daughter of Lex, back in continuity, I thought she was long gone. So, we're seeing a return, and they're very welcome returns from my perspective. And so, yeah, while it did feel like a little bit of a slap in the face to Pete that he's just sitting there with this grin on his face at the wedding, not saying a word, nevertheless, he was there. And that was a huge first step, because if this were a few years ago, he just wouldn't have been there at all. So it's like he's there. We don't know exactly at this moment in time, as of this recording, exactly what the backstory is. Hopefully we'll get that reveal. But just the fact that he was there was huge. But to your point, the fact that now Lana and John Henry are setting up their base of operations in Smallville, I mean, that really opens up a spot for him. But that's, to me, he should be the George Bailey of Smallville. He should be the Smallville guy, our representation of the town itself, right? Ma and Pa represent home and the spirit of Smallville. But as far as the town itself, I feel like it should be Pete. And Pete should be the guy, if something's going down, like, he's going to be the first one out to the farm, right? He's going to be the one to clue Clark in. I mean, I feel like there are ways, I think, to kind of get him in on things. So that's sort of what I envision. But I don't dislike your idea of him being in Metropolis and kind of pursuing that detective interest, if that's something that could be worked back into the character. I guess my question, this is my other question to you, is, because we've talked a lot about Jimmy Olsen on this podcast, and we love Jimmy as that pal for Clark and Superman. So I guess, especially if Pete is in Metropolis, I don't know, can the stories serve both Jimmy and Pete?
No, honestly, having heard your idea, it would work with mine, because he could be, Clark can easily have the conversation by getting to Smallville in half a minute or something like that. If I had to have something involving law enforcement, Peter could be the new Chief Parker or whatever. But no, I like your idea of him just having just a nice general town job and just being there. Because, I mean, Clark and Jimmy, I've never been convinced by Jimmy being Superman's pal, because he's not really incorporated into Superman's life other than when there's an adventure to be going on. And again, the DC editors, they don't, well, it'll probably change now Mr. Kaminsky's there, but they never seem to be able to decide what the relationship is between Jimmy and Clark and Lois. It's like one issue, it's, Miss Lane and Mr. Kent, and the other, it's they're all pals. So if they'd straighten these things out, but no, Pete could certainly fill a role that Jimmy doesn't fill. Jimmy's got his own adventures going on. Pete could be the solid citizen. And no, if I were wearing a hat, I'd be tipping it to you.
Well, and also, I guess, the other thing is, I mean, I do always make the argument that Jimmy could and should know the secret, but that's typically not the case. So if we retain that Jimmy doesn't know that Clark is Superman, then that creates more space for Pete if he knows, and they can have those types of honest conversations. And it's a similar argument that we make with Jimmy and why there's a function for him to serve, right? Yeah, Lois is his heart. That's his person. They're open with each other, but there's a difference between your significant other and your buddy, right? You can open up in a different way. There's something different that's kind of being served there. So I like that. Now, this kind of leads to, I guess, my other central question for you, which is, if we're really adhering to this traditional model where Pete knows the secret, and he doesn't tell Clark, but he guards it, and he creates these excuses for Clark, and it's a lot of fun. What should the ultimate payoff to that be? Because we'll get to this, right? There's this point in the Bronze Age, and we had hit on this when we did our Superboy coverage, but when we get deeper into the Bronze Age, Pete's son, John Ross, another son wiped from continuity, he never came back, but John is taken by this alien race, and Superman fails to save him. But it's at this point that Pete finally reveals to Clark, I know you're Superman, I need your help. And Superman doesn't deliver, and Pete loses it. And he has this villainous turn. Now, ultimately, he comes back out the other side, but there is this villainous turn. And then in the post-crisis landscape, we're not dealing with the Pete who knew the secret, but I've talked a lot about my fandom and appreciation of the character Conduit, this villain from the mid-90s, with this Power Rangers-esque costume design. But there, it's not Pete. It's a different character, Kenny Braverman, who grew up alongside Clark and was always jealous of Clark's excellence in academics and athletics. And as an adult, he targets Clark, then learns that Clark is Superman. And this just enrages him further because he felt like Clark had this advantage, even though his powers didn't develop until later. But I always feel like it's a little bit nebulous there with Clark and why he was excelling quite so much. But anyway, that wasn't Pete. And they never tried to make us think it was Pete. But it's the sort of thing where I think about Conduit and I'm like, I love Pete, right? It's not like I want him to be a villain per se, but at the same time, I'm like, that probably should have been Pete. I feel like, anyway, I guess my point is, if we're talking about a Pete who knows the secret in the past, or even if we're not, I don't know, this idea of Pete being a villain, I feel like they toy with over time, like they have toyed with this idea in a few places. So I guess my question is there any value in him having that villainous turn?
I don't think so. No, I was chuffed to bits. Really, really pleased that Kenny was created and he took that turn and that wasn't given to Pete because, you make a good case as to why it could have been Pete. But to me, that would have just destroyed one of my favorite characters. I mean, for that small period when he was framed by Ruin to be Ruin, the idea that was Pete, I've seen it too many times in the likes of Spider-Man where the pal becomes the villain. And I don't think Pete never wanted a reward in the first place for being his pal. And I'm happy for the payoff to be that he just knows that he helped Clark, and just for them to have a good relationship. I would have liked them as adults for Pete or for Clark to have learned that Pete knew and to have been, good open friends as adults without having to have had the terribly dramatic business with poor John Ross getting kidnapped. But it finally happened, but it was so disappointing that after that, we had years before whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow and Pete's, I think it was his next and final appearance. But, they didn't, after that, it was the perfect opportunity after DC Comics Presents, for Pete and Clark to have some chats about the old days and become good pals. And it never happened. It was just, one dramatic sequence in DC Comics Presents. And I think it was never referred to again that he knew. In fact, they never really did anything with John Ross knowing the secret other than, beating Mr. Mix's Pitlick on one occasion, as you do. So, yeah, I'm certainly glad Pete didn't go the villainous route. I think I'd rather him not be seen than to be gone. I think we needed justice for Emil Hamilton episode because of what they did to him, So please don't do it to my Pete.
You know what? I think I'm done with Emil Hamilton. He's had enough villainous turns in his earliest appearances. Mm-hmm. And then after the Brainiac 13 business, when he was corrupted by the tech, and then as Ruin, 3 strikes, you're out. In the past, I would have co-signed on what you just said immediately. And I would have said, yes, Emil Hamilton. Because historically, I've been a fan of the character. But going back and revisiting all of this stuff together, I'm like, no, I think this guy has shown his true colors enough. So nuts to that guy.
You're thinking in terms of in story, whereas I'm thinking of what the creators do to him. But I think we're both right on that one. But yes. I mean, Superman, after turn number 2, you shouldn't have been trusting him by then. But these things happen, sadly.
But so, no, I appreciate your perspective though on Pete. And I mean, ultimately I pose the question as a thought exercise, as for purposes of discussion, and to play devil's advocate a little bit. Ultimately, I agree with you in that I prefer Pete as the friend rather than a villain. Yep. However, I guess where we differ a little bit is if the choice is between Pete having a heel turn versus not seeing him, I guess I'm at least a little more on the fence on that front, where I say to myself, all right, if we're really not going to serve him and there's really not, now I think we've made a good case of why there can be space for him and what role he can serve. But it's like, okay, if we're, especially in this post-crisis landscape, like he was there. And I think there was an attempt by the creators to incorporate him, pairing him up with Lana, certainly, right? Being Lex's VP, like that was a great choice, I thought. But then going back and looking through that whole Loeb Kelly era again, it's like, yeah, he was a vice president. Boy, did he have little to do. I mean, he was there, every now and then, but it's like there wasn't really much for him to do. So it's like if well, I don't want him to be a villain per se. If it's that, or he's just going to kind of be there but not have a ton to do, then I say to myself, I don't know. To me, it probably would have been more interesting if he were Ruin as opposed to Emil Hamilton, or if he had been Conduit instead of creating a new character. Like I said, I do want to be clear. My main point is not that I wanted him to be those characters, but it's just if it's a choice between him not really being served, and I this is what I feel like is going on, and I could be wrong. I can't speak for these creators, but I have to imagine that in the Triangle era and post, because that's where the Ruin business happens. I have to imagine that there was enough love for Pete Ross on their part, enough history, enough appreciation where they didn't want to sully that character, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yet at the same time, there really wasn't enough for them to do with him. And so he ended up being, I think, neglected more often than not, right? Like they're not going to go so far as to make him a villain, but there's not really a ton that they can do with him either. So I feel like he just kind of fell into this weird spot where they were protective of him to a point, yet there was still only so much that they could do with him. And that's why I feel like it becomes a tough period of time where there's just not really a lot of space for him.
That is a great point. I mean, what did you think of the business with him getting together with Lana finally? Because obviously, she said when they got married in Action Comics 700 that she'd started to fall for Pete by the time they got to high school. And given what we've seen with adult Lana, because this was the Byrne continuity post crisis, where she just basically mooned after him for years, and she was all sad and didn't have much of a life, and was basically the town spinster. She was that the idea that she'd been interested in Pete, it was just so unconvincing to me. And then they got married. I mean, I'm not surprised the marriage failed because it didn't seem to be any basis for it at all.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's somewhat hard for me to answer because reading those stories as a kid, it fit to me, right? And I starting with the death of Superman, I didn't have that prior context, and I definitely didn't have any of the pre-crisis history in my head. It kind of made sense to me. Now, though, going back through all of it again, yeah, I mean, it does feel like it was sort of doomed to fail. But at the same time, I get if there is an interest on the part of the creators to make Pete a part of the proceedings, right? Like pairing him with Lana does make sense because when Smallville is represented, especially in that era, yes, it's primarily Jonathan and Martha, but when that is extended beyond the Kents, it's Lana, right? Lana becomes that representation of the rest of Smallville. And so if you pair Pete with her, it's like, well, okay, now you've created a spot for him. So, it makes sense to me. But then, yeah, I think, this notion of him always being her second choice, I think from Lana's perspective, Pete's own understanding at a deep level and the audience's view on it as well. I feel like, you just can't shake that idea that he was never her first choice. And so, yeah, I don't know how much it really does for him ultimately.
Yeah, it was heartbreaking. I mean, even if back in those days, they had 4 monthly comics, 1 quarterly, occasional specials, annuals. They could have found somewhere just to have maybe a couple of stories where we see them courting and realizing, that there was a spark there, that feelings had changed, that Lana had moved on a little bit, and that Pete had always liked her, perhaps, but it was just sort of nowhere. But then again, at least we saw more of Pete having a life with a wife there than we did pre-crisis, so that was something.
Yeah, I guess one other kind of big picture question that I wanted to pose to you is this is called Justice for Pete Ross, right? And, we've talked about these instances where the character has been a bit neglected, but is there one injustice towards the character? And I could probably guess the answer, but one injustice towards Pete that stands above the rest to you?
He did so much for him. And the big injustice for me is the Pete pre-crisis fact that, when Pete asked Clark to do one thing for him and bring his son home, he didn't do it. He just Clark fell back on the, oh no, I can't change history, even though it wasn't history at that point. It was the Legion's history, but the Legion's history is always a possible future from Superman's point of view. And that was where he finally fell on it. And I think Clark totally let Pete down. It was just, he just came out with the usual superhero idea that, yeah, I can't change destiny. I can't change this. You've just got to live with it. I'm off to my next adventure. Bye bye. And that really did mean Pete took a villainous turn. And it was, they sorted out in the comics within a year of the letter in which the readers let flack, that they let rip because they absolutely hated the story, as did I. And to me, I think that was the biggest injustice. I mean, it's sad that we never even found out who his wife was back then, but no, Pete deserved so much more. He never asked for anything until that one thing, which was a pretty reasonable thing to ask. Actually, no, to be fair, he had asked, in a very stupid story, he had asked Superman to tell John his identity, because John had that very specific psychological condition in which he would die if he didn't know who Superman really was. But ignoring that because it was utterly stupid, there was this was a serious matter. His kid had been taken by aliens, and Superman investigates and decides, nah, you've got to live with it. Your kid's got to be by himself on a planet thousands of miles away, and he's got to become a warrior warlord killing people. To me, that was the biggest injustice. I mean, how about yourself?
I guess I'm a little bit torn between that and Pete being killed off panel and stuffed in a box in Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. But
Yeah.
I think ultimately I agree with you. I think that DC Comics Presents story was the toughest pill to swallow. I was asking earlier, if Pete knows the secret and he keeps it to himself, like what is the payoff to that? And I think that DC Comics Presents story gives you, I think, the beginning of what can be a good payoff. Like something happens and look, it involves his son. Like if there's one thing, speaking as a dad, it's like if there's one thing that will make you break a promise, cross that line, do whatever you have to do, right? It's your child being in danger. So the fact that after all these years, Pete's never told a soul, but now his son is in trouble. So now he's finally going to confront Clark about this.
Yeah.
He's not going to hold back anymore. That I think is the beginning of a good story. But yeah, from Superman's perspective, it's like, I hated to see Pete turn as dark as he did, as quickly as he did after Superman failed to save John. But it's like, I understand. The thing that always bothered me about that is that it was never put forth from either Clark or Pete. If John can't come back to Earth, right, why can't Pete go to this planet? Right? I feel like that could have been some sort of middle ground so they could at least be together.
There's an idea for Pete to be warlord. Yeah, absolutely. Because it wasn't even like this was a kid that had just been introduced to the story. He wasn't a cipher. This was a kid who actually called Clark Uncle Clark. We saw him in the story staying overnight with him at Clark's apartment. He was basically a member of Clark's family. And it was just, I don't know what Paul Levitt was thinking there, because he was usually so on the ball. And okay, having it be Pete and John gave the story more emotional resonance. But yes, the payoff was so terrible. And I don't believe for a second that Paul Levitt intended that Phantom Stranger follow-up to bring John home. I think that was going to be it. But the fact that, when the letter call came out a few months later, it's like, we're giving Paul a special corner of the letter call to answer all the readers. Like, yeah, quite, because we're very annoyed at this. It's just, I mean, for any little kids reading the comic, to think that, oh, you might get kidnapped by aliens, don't think Superman's going to save you. It's just madness. And yeah, I mean, I think I would have been like Pete was. I would have just gone bonkers and I'd be tearing up Superman posters in Metropolis Asylum pretty quickly. So sad.
Yeah, I know that was a very tough turn. So yeah, I would probably put that at the top of my list. I mean, him being killed off panel and whatever happened, that was, it's the sort of thing, right? That story overall was quite the bloodbath, and a lot of people met their final fate in that. And the idea that Pete is going to lose his life because of this knowledge that he has guarded for so many years. And that this is one of the inciting incidents to the story because it happened so early on and leads to Clark's identity being exposed. I mean, that in and of itself, I don't object to the idea of it, but I think in terms of the execution, no pun intended, it's like having Pete's lifeless body pop out of that box.
Horrible, yeah.
I know it was such a short story. There just were not pages for this. I understand that. But it's like in an ideal world, if Pete is going to pay the price, right? If that's the payoff to Pete knowing the secret, is that ultimately he's going to pay the ultimate price for it, I just wish we could have seen him fighting for his life or fighting to defend Clark's secret to the very end, right? Like he gets taken by Toyman and Prankster and you get a moment of him.
That would be lovely. But I mean, on the other hand, the villains do say through the little Superman figures that we were going to kidnap all of your friends, any of your friends, and see if anybody knew the identity. And it just so happened that the struck paid out with Pete first time. And it specifically said that Pete only told them via brainwashing.
Yeah.
So I think Pete would have got killed anyway. I think any of them, whichever order they'd kidnapped any one of them, they would have any one of them would have ended up dead. So I think it speaks to the nobility of Pete that he didn't just give up the identity again. He defended it to his dying moments. And yes, Pete deserved panel time, but I'm kind of glad that we didn't see him actually get killed. And as you say, everyone was getting killed at some point in that story, pretty much in that story, apart from Lois. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I found it incredibly exciting to read at the time. And on the other hand, I also hate it at the same time. It's just, I mean, just saying, aren't they all? It's just so dismissive. Superman's friends, they deserved a happy ending, and there was no way that was a happy ending for Superman and Lois at the end, because most of the people they knew had died horribly. It was no, but yeah, they all deserve better, and Pete certainly deserved better because yes, he'd been such a good, noble friend. He'd asked for nothing, and he ended up with the same horrible death that many of the rest of them got.
I do agree that dialogue about how he put up a fight and it was only through brainwashing that they got the secret, that was much appreciated. I'm glad they gave Pete that. And I agree. I wouldn't need to see him literally be tortured or killed, but yeah, just sort of to be able to be with him for some moment to show his bravery. But like I said, I just know there wasn't time for that. So yeah, I think all in all, that DC Comics Presents story is probably the worst that they've done that character. Aw Yeah Comics celebrates everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations, Harrison, New York, Muncie, Indiana, or Skokie, Illinois, home to our pal, Sweet Sweet Bernie. If you have children and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow them on social media. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. As a Superman fan, have you ever wondered what would happen if a person who knew barely anything about comics decided to absorb hundreds of Superman stories from all eras and media? Robbo is that kind of person. And that's exactly what he's done on a new show called This Podcast Will Never Die. The first season, called Superman Will Never Die, starts with the unexpected ways the Man of Steel stood out from the pulp heroes on the newsstands in 1938. Listen and subscribe to This Podcast Will Never Die, and you'll never look at Superman's trunks the same way again. Attention horror fans, Colleen, A Vlada Tale of the Damned is the forthcoming comic book sequel to Vlada, A Dracula Tale, a gender-swapped spin on the world of Dracula, featuring an original story by Chris Denmead and art by Matt Slay and Tim Vigil. The Kickstarter campaign for this 28-page comic launches on August 15th. Visit Colleen, A Vlada Tale of the Damned on Kickstarter and sign up now to be notified on launch. Check out the Vlada, A Dracula Tale Facebook page for more. Another huge big picture aspect of all of this is Pete being largely absent from most other media adaptations of Superman stories, right? Smallville certainly being a key exception to that. We have Pete in a minor role in Man of Steel and then in BVS as well, but very, very fleeting. And I think there's probably a case to be made that certain instances where you might expect to see Pete in Smallville in one of these adaptations, that the story isn't necessarily built for it, right? I look at something like Superman the movie as a key example. I love that Smallville sequence to death, right? It's one of my favorite parts of the movie. But if you only have a short runway to spend with Clark at that point in time in Smallville, and you really want to hammer home that he has these abilities that he can't yet share with the world, and he feels apart from those around him, I don't know how much it helps to have Pete there as a buddy. I feel like it would kind of undermine the core theme that they're going for. Like when you see Clark on the football field, and the football players are, giving him a hard time and knocking over everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Lana is there, right? And Lana shows him some kindness, and that goes a long way. And you see the longing for her. Like I said, if Pete were also there to say, to offer a kind word, it's like, I don't know how much that really adds to the proceedings. So it's like, that's an instance where I understand why Pete wasn't there. I don't know if you feel similarly, but then there are other adaptations where it feels so glaring. It's like, why is Pete not part of this? I welcome your thoughts on this. Like, are there particular adaptations where you're kind of baffled that they didn't include him?
I'm not, no, because I mean, I think a lot of the time when producers are making a film, the DC people would, give them documents about, who's important in the stories, and they give them loads of comics, and sometimes obviously the people making the films would be fans themselves anyway. And because Pete Ross was seen so little outside of the Superboy stories, I mean, he was barely there in the Bronze Age and in various at other points. He wasn't seen as an important character, and when you got relatively little screen time for the non-action parts, I think he's just bound to be overlooked because he's not the girlfriend, he's not the work rival, he's not the snapper colleague who gets into adventures themselves. So because no one had carved out a proper role for Peter in the comics as an adult, I think it's not surprising he was there. I mean, because it was strange, really, because in the Silver Age, Mort Weisinger, the editor of Superman, Superboy, etc., he would bring in characters in Superboy, and if the readers liked it, he'd then bring them into the adult comics or whatever. And it just seemed weird that, given that Pete was such a successful cast member in the Superboy comics, that he wasn't more than in a very, very occasional cameo in Mort Weisinger's adult comics. I think he turned up for the 25th anniversary of Superman's arrival on Earth or something like that. But he wasn't really seen in Mort Weisinger's comics. And then that carried through to the Bronze Age. He was barely seen at all. So I think that's probably why he just didn't turn up much in the adaptations. But and that didn't disappoint me, because even I, as a big fan of the Superboy comics and I enjoyed Pete Ross. I didn't miss him because I didn't expect him to be there.
I guess for me, in terms of these appearances or adaptations, there was the 1961 Superboy television pilot, which we covered last year. Now, that was 1961, which was the same year Pete debuted in the comic. So the fact that he's not there in the pilot makes sense. They're so close in time. But, presumably had that show gone to series, I would hope and I would expect that Pete would have popped up at some point. But I understand why he's not in that pilot. There's the Filmation Superboy shorts, which we also talked about. This one's kind of nebulous because there is a blonde-haired classmate who we see in a few of these shorts, and he's never named. So I don't know. He could be Pete. If there's going to be a blonde classmate, he's Pete, right? I mean, I think one of the most glaring omissions is the Superboy TV series from 88 to 92.
Yep.
Now there, and we've talked about this, right? The first two seasons are set at Schuster University in Florida, where Pete and Lana, not Pete, I got Pete on the brain, where Clark and Lana attend. And then the setting shifts to this government agency in the third and fourth seasons. Arguably, right, you already have Clark and Lana going from Smallville to Florida together to attend school. It might have been a bit much if Pete also tagged along. So I understand if Pete's not a classmate at the school. However, there were episodes, and they were among my favorite of the series, where Clark went back to Smallville. I feel like that would have been a key opportunity to maybe have a check-in with Pete.
That would have been perfect, and I would have loved to see that. I suppose Pete didn't go to Florida because as a pale blonde, the sun wouldn't be great for him. But yeah, they could certainly have had him in there. That could have been his big opportunity.
And there is, because they did a comic book series that sort of tied in or set in the continuity of the show.
That was lovely. That was a lovely tie-in. Kurt Swanart.
Yeah, and I think it was the first issue. It's like the night before Clark leaves for Schuster, and Pete is there. There's like a farewell party or something. I forget the exact details. So Pete was in the comic book, but yeah, I feel like there could have been a place for him in that show, especially when he goes back. But I feel like, to me, the my biggest gripe with Pete's absence is Superman and Lois, our most recent live action television series. I don't understand why Kyle Cushing wasn't Pete Ross. Could have been the same actor, same everything. Just call him Pete.
Yes. I don't know. I mean, there's no famous people in America called Pete Ross, is there? I don't think. I think there was some sportsman who died in 2005 or something like that, but I can't think of any reason why they couldn't use the Pete Ross name. So it should have been Pete Ross, because yes, Smallville adult Pete Ross could have been doing all sorts of things there. So why on earth? Yeah, it is unjust. Someone is against Pete Ross there.
Well, and more than that, I don't know if you recall this, but in the fourth and final season, there's the scene where Kyle is asking Clark to be his best man, and there's a reference to Petey having died, seemingly, right? Because this is right after Clark has returned from the dead, and Kyle has this line about, like, first Petey, then you, like, I thought you'd outlive us all. So the implication really seems to be that Petey, if Petey is actually Pete Ross, has died.
Well, that's just twisting the knife. There's no need for that, is there?
Well, that's what I'm saying. So,
I mean, why did they finally bring him in? They finally mentioned possibly Pete Ross, probably Pete Ross, and again killed off screen.
Yeah, and there had been an earlier mention. I think it might go back as far as the pilot, where Lana's talking about all the weird things that happened when they were growing up, and she references a car accident that Pete was involved in as well. And we got a flash to that in another episode. So, like, there were a couple of fleeting mentions of him, but then, yeah, seemingly he's died off screen.
I wonder if they got the car accident, Anthony, from in the Triangle area, when we had that flashback Dan Jurgens issue with them all getting drunk and their classmate, eventually dying. The rest of the public service announcement issue on Don't Drink, Kids.
Yeah.
And have Pete be the one who die.
Yeah, I mean, so in Superman and Lois, I believe Lana references that car crash. Her point was that it was crazy we were all okay. So I think Pete survived that. I think if Pete is Petey in this, I think he died later, not in that car crash per se. But I agree that's probably the inspiration for that. But yeah, it's just the sort of thing. And even with Kyle, right? It became a plot point that he's Hispanic and his mother or grandmother had changed their name to something ethnically neutral, right? From Cortez to Cushing. So you could have had the same sort of thing where you still cast a Hispanic actor. The character's name is Pete Ross. And then you reveal that, oh yeah, no, there was this other bit of a family history. So because I love the character of Kyle and his portrayer, like he really grew on me. I felt like he was the unsung hero of that series. And he really brought a lot of humanity.
Unsung hero.
That's the thing. And for people listening to this who maybe don't feel as strongly about Pete, you're probably saying, like, well, what difference does it make? Like, if it's really just a matter of the name. And I guess that's fair, but I mean, I don't know. It's like, if this is
the name should be better known, Pete deserves that.
That's the thing. And I feel like if this is a character who's part of the mythology and you have an opportunity to utilize it, I mean, I really can't think of much other than we had Pete Ross on Smallville, right? Played by actor Sam Jones III.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I know he ended up having some real life legal issues. Nothing as extreme as another co-star on that show.
Let's not go there.
But I can't imagine that would have impacted their choice all those years later. So I really don't know. I would be curious to kind of hear from anyone involved with the show, because it just feels like, hey man, this would have been a key opportunity to have Pete there.
Yes, I would love to know. I mean, maybe next adaptation, you never know.
I mean, there are other places like Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman. I mean, they only used Lana once in an alternate reality. So I wouldn't really expect them to go as far as Pete, right? So there's an instance where, yeah, it would have been cool if Pete had come to visit Clark in the big city at some point, but I understand why the show didn't do that. But, Superman and Lois is one where I'm just like, man, come on. But, of course, where we really get the most prominent usage of Pete Ross is Smallville. Like we said, played by Sam Jones III. He's a supporting character and series regular for the first 3 seasons. And early on in season 2, he learns the secret. Now, it's very different than the comics. He doesn't discover it and keep it to himself, but rather he finds Clark's spaceship, and Clark has no choice but to reveal himself to Pete. And it's a great episode. It's one of the few that's really focused on their friendship. I know, obviously, I've talked a lot about Smallville, and it's very near and dear to me. I know you don't have the attachment to the show that I do, but I'm just curious.
I've only watched about the first 2 or 3 seasons in full because it just the tone, just the teen angst. You were watching it at a younger age. I was, bitter old git. So
I know it's totally fine. But before I go on further about my thoughts on Smallville's Pete, what are your thoughts? Like, what, I'm curious, just from your experience watching it the first time, or if you rewatched anything now, I welcome your thoughts on him.
In terms of the Pete and Clark relationship on that I saw, they seem to have zero chemistry, the actors. And I think Sam Jones III was ill-served by the script she was given, because Pete was just seemed a little bit dopey. I mean, he just seemed to want to do little other than hang around throwing hoops in the yard or driving his car. And then when he did find out Clark's secret, he just got so pouty and bitter at having not been told the secret in advance. It just seemed quite unlikable. I mean, it was an interesting episode in terms of the drama, but again, it just didn't get. I just wanted more happiness, and maybe I was just missing the joy.
Yeah, we get a lot of scenes of them shooting hoops, which I do always enjoy. And yeah, he's there to be this buddy. When he learns the secret, that definitely opens things up. And then you see him helping Clark, going on investigations with him, making excuses for him to help protect the secret.
Oh, that's good.
It's not a huge part of the show, to be honest, even at that point. But you do have moments of that. I mean, as far as the episode where he learns the secret, yes, a very different spin on the pre-crisis version. But I loved that scene because we have Clark super speed in front of Pete's car as Pete is driving away, and he stops the car, right? And that's the big reveal. And then we cut to them in the storm cellar where Clark has clearly laid out a lot of the particulars of this, and Pete's kind of spiraling. And Pete's not upset that Clark is an alien, right? But it's the fact that he never confided in Pete, and he's been lying. And that's what's really got him so upset. And I love this. One of my favorite part of that whole episode where Pete's like, what, you think I can't handle it? And Clark goes, can you?
Yeah, that was fair comment. And thinking on, actually, Pete's response is quite realistically teenage.
Yeah, I mean, 100%.
He would be upset, probably.
Yeah.
I think I'm just comparing, which is unfair because it's a different continuity, it's a different world, it's a different Pete. Comparing it to, original T-comic Pete's madly noble, sane, adult response. Yeah, the TV Pete's response probably is more realistic. And if I could just, compartmentalize a bit better, I would be fairer to TV Pete.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of points of distinction. One, with the pre-crisis Pete, right? They hadn't grown up together. In his first appearance, we see Pete's just moved to Smallville, right? And that's when they meet. I mean, whereas here on Smallville, they'd known each other their whole lives, right? So they had this history. And so I think that's what made the betrayal sting a bit more. And then again, plus like the way in which Pete finds out, I think is pretty jarring in the show. So I understand him being thrown by it. And then over the course of that episode, we have not Emil Hamilton, but Dr. Stephen Hamilton, who's working for Lex, and he ends up stealing the spaceship and kidnapping Pete, and Clark has to rescue him. And, Pete, by the end of that episode, realizes like, okay, I see what a risk this is, what a responsibility. I understand why you kept this from me. And it's a great scene in the storm cellar with Jonathan and Martha, and they really bring him into the fold. And, Jonathan's offering a warning about how dangerous this is. And Clark's like, that's my dad's way of welcoming you to the family. So I like that episode a lot. And the fact that it was really focused on their friendship. There's another episode in season 3 called Velocity. Not a particularly beloved episode of Smallville. I think that's fair to say. It's basically a ripoff of The Fast and the Furious, where Pete has gotten involved in illegal street racing. And, and to soup up the engines of the car, they use kryptonite, because what else? Yeah. So the setup is a bit goofy, but I actually think it's quite an underrated episode. And I rewatched it. I didn't ask you to, but I rewatched this because it was one of the other really Pete-centric episodes of the show, because Pete has this, he refuses to throw a race, and the guy who's organizing all of this demands $20,000 from Pete to make up this guy's loss. And Pete goes to Clark. And this is at the point in time where Clark had his whole Red K bender at the start of season 3, and he was in Metropolis going by Cal, and he's breaking into ATM machines and all this stuff. And Pete says, he's like, can't you go Cal on an ATM and get me this money? Right. Like he's, reluctant to ask, but basically saying like, they're going to kill me. They're going to kill my family. Like, I need your help. And it puts Clark in a really tough position. And he ends up stealing a car from Lex. He returns it later. But it really puts Clark in a very compromised position. And at the end of the episode, it's this great moment between the two of them. They don't play hoops because Clark is really upset about what's happened here. But Pete does have this moment. He's like, I swear, Clark, like till the day I die, I'll never disrespect your powers again. I like that moment between them. It's a goofy episode, but I think Pete learned a really important lesson there. And then we get to the end of season 3, and this rogue FBI agent who's working first for Lex, then for Lionel, kidnaps Pete and tortures him, beats him up, tries to get information about Clark. And Lex is actually the one who rescues him. But Pete's takeaway is that it's too dangerous for him to have to protect the secret. And he leaves town because his parents have divorced and his mom is moving to Wichita. He was going to stay in Smallville with his dad and finish out his senior year.
Yep.
And then he decides to move away. And so, you get this tearful goodbye. He goes, I'll see you around, Clark.
It was sad. There was so much blood on poor Pete's face. It was awful. It was really hideous. In the first couple of scenes, he's given Clark some pretty good advice as regards Lana. Lana's about to go off to Paris. And he's actually being a really good, mature, sensible friend. So obviously there was, sides to Pete that I hadn't remembered or hadn't seen previously.
One of my favorite Pete moments is actually before he ever even learns the secret. There's one of the early season 1 episodes, X-Ray, when Clark develops his X-ray vision. Pete doesn't know the secret yet, but they're investigating together, and Pete's giving Clark a hard time. And Clark's like, remind me why I'm friends with you. And Pete goes, because even when I think you're whacked, I still show up ready to rumble. And I just said to myself, I'm like, yeah, like that's Pete. Like he's got his back, even when he thinks Clark's a little nuts. So I like that. But my larger take on this, and I've shared this before, it's been a while, but so I won't go through the whole thing. But basically, while I enjoyed the character of Chloe at the time when I was watching the show, in retrospect, I really do feel like in order to build the character of Chloe, they had to siphon away traits and dynamics from other characters and other relationships in order to build her, right? So she's the one running the school paper. She has the interest in journalism. So when you bring Lois in, she has to have a few seasons of just kind of bouncing around before they zero in on the journalism side, because that's Chloe's space, right? Lana becomes kind of just the object of affection for Clark. She's not also the best friend because that's the place that Chloe occupies. Right. And then similarly, I feel like they had less to do with Pete because they had Chloe. And in fact, they ultimately give Chloe, it's so funny. They ultimately give Chloe the pre-crisis Pete story. Because in season 4, Chloe learns the secret, doesn't tell Clark, and just helps him silently by making up these excuses for him and whatnot. So they ultimately gave her that. And I also think, the character of Whitney Fordman, Lana's boyfriend in the first season, that could have been Pete. I mean, I think that with a little bit of massaging, right? You wouldn't have wanted to make him quite so antagonistic towards Clark at the outset, but it's like, there's another character, right? Who's another love interest for Lana, I just feel like and look, I know, especially in the first season of a show, like, you don't want to populate this world, but I think that it just wasn't set up to really give a character like Pete enough to do ultimately, right? And even in terms of the friendship, right? That whole show at its heart, I would argue, right, is about this doomed friendship between Clark and Lex. So a lot of the friendship scenes are between Clark and Lex, and it's great, but it leaves less for Clark and Pete to do.
Gotcha, yeah. Because then whenever it was Lex and Clark, or Lex and anybody, just the screen just sizzled.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny though. This is just an aside. It's funny when you were talking about saying that in the TV show, Pete and Clark had grown up together, and in the comics, Pete came as an early teenager, which is entirely true. But within a year, Roy Thomas did not invent retroactive continuity because they were contradicting that with. Did you ever come across a story called The Amazing Tots of Smallville?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, it's a wonderful one. Superboy 100 and something, but it's a flashback tale to Super Baby, and it's showing there's big, you've got baby Lana, baby Clark, baby Lex, and baby Pete, and they're basically just all getting totally under the feet of a bunch of bootleggers in town, and then in the end, I think the bootleggers get caught by the police or driven out of town because Clark's bashing them with a club. But little Pete, he's there, so you could get around it and say, he was there as a kid, the parents moved away, they came back, everybody forgot they'd ever known Pete. But it's like, obviously, Pete had become so popular, he was right in the gang as if he'd already always been one of the Peanuts kids,
Yeah, no, absolutely. We love digging into epic comic book runs, but what about the art of the single issue? Single Bound is a new podcast series hosted by married couple Amy and Logan as they review single issues of comics. And if the title also makes you think of Superman, you're not alone, as the Man of Steel is Logan's favorite character and a regular topic of discussion on Single Bound. Listen and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube, and follow the show on Instagram at Single Bound Podcast. We all love the big-budget superhero films, but the world of independent cinema remains a place of unbridled creative freedom and entrepreneurial spirit. Whether you're an independent filmmaker yourself, or you just love movies, don't miss these New Jersey film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, and Round Reel in Bloomfield. Submission information for filmmakers can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and much more. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Thank you. So we've hit on a lot of these, I think, big picture questions, topics, themes. I want to run through a little bit more specifically some of our reading list, because there's some really, I think, fun, funny, and interesting bits here. So we've been referencing Pete's first appearance in Superboy 86 from 1961. And yeah, in that issue at least, right, he's just moved to town. I loved how and this is before he learns Clark's secret or anything like that, but Clark is getting pushed around by these kids at the movie theater, right? And Pete is quick to step in. It's like right from the jump, you see what a good stand-up, noble guy he is, right? I love that.
Good kid. No, I really like that, because it is what Clark needed, because we'd seen so many kids who'd come in for one issue, they'd have some kind of problem with their dad or their mother, and Clark would solve it. And I think Pete was so quickly an ongoing character. I mean, in his second appearance, where when after he learned the identity, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. In the final panel, he steals Superboy's wink. He's winking at the reader, thinking, as if he knows that I'm now a regular, I'm important to this. And they must have had some good mail, because I think Mort Weisinger's thing was if readers like something, they'd bring it back again and again. But yeah, in that first story, straight away, you can see there's a reason to add him to the cast, because he's bringing something different.
Yeah, absolutely. Right from the jump. And we mentioned, his interest in investigation and acting. And it is very humorous, I think, in that first issue, where he's constantly taking all of these measurements of Clark and then taking molds of Superboy's boots. And Clark is convinced that he's figuring out the identity. But then it turns out
that he's, in fact, wants to see if Clark Kent is the right person to play Superboy in a stage play. So it's his acting and his detective skills coming together to help this story barrel along there. And it turns out that Clark Kent is the perfect person to be Superboy. And obviously no one thinks he is Superboy, but well done, Pete. And it is a shame that, Pete, as we said, Pete's detective thing never came back, I mean, again, he could have come to Metropolis as an actor occasionally in adult life, something like that. He could have married Daphne Dean, the actress from The Flash, Barry Allen's childhood friend, all sorts of things, if they'd remembered that Pete Ross had an interest in acting. In fact, I think there was another story a little bit later where Pete's acting comes into it again, but was pretty quickly gone, when it just became Pete protecting the identity, or Pete's just a figure in the crowd.
Yeah. Yeah, but I just thought it was very funny at the outset here. And just Clark being like, he only pretended to be my friend. He's just trying to expose me. He's so dejected. And then it turns out that we have this payoff about Pete wanting Clark to play Superboy in the pageant, which I thought was great.
Genuinely liked him.
And then just a few issues later, like we've been saying in Superboy 90, we have this camping trip. And this, like we said, this panel that they revisit over and over and over and over, where Pete's asleep. And then there's trouble. It turns out there's this circus train that has derailed, and there's all these wild animals running around. Yeah. And so Clark changes to Superboy, but mid-change, lightning strikes, wakes up Pete and illuminates the tent. And so Pete sees Clark changing to Superboy, but decides in that moment, right, he doesn't want to be a burden to him. He's not going to tell him, and he's just going to help. And we see that, and very shortly thereafter, there's another moment where Clark needs to excuse himself to deal with an emergency, and Pete's like, "Oh, I can't see," right? Whatever, it was a big flash or something like that. He's like, "Oh, I can't see anything," and it gives Clark just the cover that he needs. And we would see tons of instances like that.
So actually, I'm totally wrong. Again and again, his acting's coming into it. It's just it's not hammered into the script. But you remind me that yes, in fact, I'm wrong again.
No, but and also in that issue, right? That the Superboy 90, that's also where one of the ways Pete's going to help Clark is he makes a Superboy costume, and like you were saying, a mask. I don't know. I mean, it's a perfect recreation of Superboy's face. And even in that issue, like he stands in for Superboy because there's a Superboy robot that's malfunctioning, right? And Pete intervenes. So yeah, another instance where they don't beat you over the head with it, but utilizing his acting skills.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's just another fun element here. You can have less of Lana Lang trying to cut his hair and have a little Pete Ross storyline.
Let me ask you this before I go further on that. Much like Lana was introduced, I think very clearly to be a young Smallville stand-in for Lois, right? Like, do you get the sense like Pete was brought in to sort of be the Smallville equivalent of a Jimmy Olsen, like to have that buddy type character, or no?
Mostly because Jimmy Olsen did have a disguise kit, didn't he? His suitcase that he would help him turn into a ginger girl, etc. So it could be. I also wonder if, again, this is just totally pulling it out of nowhere, but if Mort Weisinger, because I know the DC people were heavily involved with the 50s Superman TV series, if they were then plotting after the death of George Reeves, hoping to get a Superboy TV series off the ground, I wonder if they introduced Pete into the comics, perhaps as a character that could be used in the TV series if it went anywhere. I'm just spitballing. I mean, no one can know one way or the other.
Interesting. But all that to say, I mean, I feel like this was a very clever, sophisticated angle to take, that we're going to have this new character. He's going to learn this. I mean, him learning the secret feels like huge, especially for that point in time. Like, oh, someone's actually going to know.
Absolutely is. Because I remember as a kid, the first time I read that story, I'd read enough Silver Age DC comics at that point to know that if someone learned Superboy's identity, or Lois Lane met the perfect Superman from another planet to marry, end of the story, they're allergic to Lois's lipstick and they die. Or in Superboy, they might get amnesia, or they might die. I saw people die. And I thought Pete would be amnesiac by the end of the issue, but no, it carries on and it became an important part of the storyline. And it's wonderful. It's like they were moving the story on a little bit. And also, I think perhaps it gave the reader a little identification figure, because we're the readers, we're reading, we know Clark's secret, we might like to think that we'd protect it as well, and Pete's there, and as I say, he's occasionally winking to us.
Yeah, and I think another instance where they don't beat you over the head with this, but I think for kids reading it, I think it is a lesson in nobility and how to be a friend and be there for somebody, maybe in not quite an obvious way. I mean, I've complained about this in multiple episodes already, but in the season 4 episode of Superman and Lois, when we flash back to Clark and Jimmy at the planet, and Jimmy's put it together, he's figured out that Clark is Superman, or he thinks he has. And what does he do? He confronts Clark with it. And I'm saying to myself, no, like if you're really this guy's buddy, I don't think that's what you do. I think what Pete does here is the way, or at least it definitely elevated Pete in my eyes. The fact that he didn't throw this in Clark's face, or show that he figured something out or discovered something, but just helped in this quiet way. So I think it was a good lesson to impart to the kids.
Absolutely. The quiet hero, not asking for any reward.
I think one of my absolute favorite Silver Age stories, and you tipped me off to this, was from 1962, Superboy 94. Oh man. So this is the one where aliens are searching for Superboy planet to planet. And once they hone in on his super thoughts, somehow the world will explode. It was a little unclear, the science behind this, but if they were able to lock onto his super thoughts, it would have this disastrous result. And Superboy learns of this. And so in order to save the day, we go back to hypnotism. We just talked about the hypno glasses recently. So he hypnotizes himself to essentially think that he's a regular boy, right? He still has his powers, but he doesn't realize
it. Period of time.
Right. So that his super thoughts won't be picked up. And so then there's this robbery, and Pete's with Clark, and Pete expects Clark to spring into action. But Clark's like, I can't wait till Superboy gets here. And Pete, to his credit, immediately picks up that something is amiss. And his theory is, oh, Clark must have been exposed to red kryptonite. He doesn't remember he's Superboy. So Pete puts on his own Superboy costume and mask. I thought this was the funniest friggin' thing. And so Pete, as Superboy, goes to Clark and he's like, hey, like, do you want to join me on this adventure? And so essentially he has Clark in front of him as a human shield, right? Deflecting all of these robbers' bullets. But Pete, as Superboy, says to Clark, he's like, oh, I'm using what a thrill this will be for you. I'll use my heat vision to stop the bullets. So it's actually Clark stopping the bullets, but this Clark, who can't remember who he is, thinks it's super amazing. I thought this was so funny. I loved it.
Oh, it's bonkers. And again, it just shows how clever Pete is. It's just, it really is mad. But I loved it. I mean, I was always so delighted to see Pete in a story, because he was such a good character.
Yeah, but no, that one was a ton of fun. And then later in that issue, there's scientists who need diamonds. And so Pete / Superboy gives Clark these snowballs to crush. But meanwhile, there's coal inside and he's crushing it into diamonds. And then at the very end, there are these skiers who are trapped on the top of a mountain. Pete can't get there. But Clark has been trying out to be the big bad wolf in a school play or something. Pete, Superboy, is like, oh, hey, why don't you practice your blow as the big bad wolf, right? Yeah. So Clark blows. And everyone thinks this is just a joke, like a little gag that Superboy is doing. But really, Pete is using Clark's super breath to launch himself to the top of the mountain. Man, that was such a good one. You also tipped me off to a story from 1963, Superboy 106. We talk about the era of the quote unquote super dickery. Man, this was an instance of that, where Superboy fakes his death because he wants to see if Pete would be a worthy successor to the mantle of Superboy. This
absolutely appalling behavior.
Yeah. What else do you want to say about this one?
It's madness. I mean, it's just madness that Superboy is actually so morbid. He's thinking about such things, and then just to put a normal guy that he calls his friend through so much to try and prove a point that doesn't need to be proven, because there's all kinds of people or things or robots they could fill in when he was dead. It doesn't make Superboy seem likable or intelligent at all. It's like, who's the super dick? You are. Pete shows that he's got the stuff. He can.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, because there's a serum that he takes that replicates Superboy's powers, and the costume and the mask of all of this. And in a way, he's actually a step above Superboy, because he's not Kryptonian, so he's not vulnerable to kryptonite. So he has that going for him. But just the fact that Clark would make Pete think he's dead. And, to the story's credit, Martha calls Clark out on this. She's like, isn't this cruel? And then the other thing, too, is that the serum's going to wear off at an undetermined point in time. And she's like, what if something happens? And Clark doesn't really address the cruelty piece of this, but he's like, well, I'm going to keep constant watch on Pete. But yeah, it was just the sort of thing. I mean, the idea that Clark is so concerned with his crusade continuing on, even if something happens to him, that he would want to make sure there's a successor in place. And that even though he doesn't know, Pete knows his secret, that he sees Pete as being a worthy successor to be the next Superboy. Like, all of that I think is intriguing, but it's just like, to make the guy think you're dead.
Don't the powers begin to fade? Even Pete's powers begin to fade one by one. Superboy's still continuing the experiment. He's nuts, absolute nutter. It's like, if you're judging him on that basis, then Superboy's not worthy of his powers.
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of bits with the Legion of Superheroes that I thought were interesting. In 1962, there's Superboy 98. That's the Ultra Boy appearance, where Ultra Boy comes to Smallville to try to figure out Superboy's secret identity. And Pete decides to lock away his journal with all of his thoughts in a safe deposit box. And I mean, I don't want to go through the whole issue, but ultimately, Ultra Boy realizes, because he uses his Ultra Vision, or the Penetra Vision, which was called at the time, right, to read the contents of Pete's journal, and realizes that Pete knows the secret. So I like that kind of acknowledgement, and the Legion's aware of Pete, and that acknowledgement of what he's doing.
Absolutely. But Anthony, I was surprised that someone as savvy as Pete Ross would be writing it down in a journal,
I know, but I think that like
Keeping
he
in his head.
catches, but it's like he catches himself, and that's why he wants to lock it away in the safe deposit box. So I mean,
That's true, but is it? Yeah, it's still dubious. But I mean, it's not the one where at the end the Legion decided a piece worthy of Legion membership, well, reserve membership or substitute membership, whichever one it was that week.
yeah, Ultra Boy gives him a coin that will allow him to attend a meeting or something like that.
One meeting. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, because I think Marla Latham, the adult advisor, says he'd persuade Superboy to bring Pete to a meeting. It's like, well, on what basis? Unless it's just bring your pal to a meeting day.
Yeah. And then there's a later story in Adventure Comics 370 from 1968 where Pete and Lana are mixed up in an adventure. And at the end of the story, the Legion is erasing Lana's memories of the events, but they allow Pete to keep his memory. And I think it's Mon-El who says to him, essentially like it's a reward for all of his efforts, but also there's this business that his knowledge will help Clark in the future. So that's why they're letting
I think it'll save his life one day or something like that. But it's good. It's good. It's great that he was actually, Superboy didn't know what a good friend he was, but his pals in the future did. And possibly Pete would go down in history.
Yes, that's the thing. Like, that's the thing with those couple of stories where to me, it's just like, it's kind of cementing Pete's place in the larger mythology and the fact that he is acknowledged in that way by Clark's other friends, which I thought was really cool. And then I guess like as we go into the Bronze Age here, I mean, I welcome your thoughts. I mean, my view is that we definitely get less of Pete. Is that fair to say in the Bronze Age?
Yeah, I mean, you'd still see him occasionally in the Superboy stories, but I mean, I was having a look around at the covers on the Grand Comic Book database to see if he was popping up here and there, but I found a whole list by putting him into the Grand Comic Book database of Pete issues, and I was going through them all, and he would just appear for a panel here, a panel there. Very rarely have a decent appearance, and I think in the Bronze Age, he was actually more significantly seen in the Superman stories.
Oh, okay.
And even that was very rare.
Well, one of the ones
that
you tipped
to do with John Ross.
Well, even before that, one of the ones you tipped me off to, and I thank you, was from Superman 270 from 1973. It's one of the Private Life of Clark Kent backups.
Wonderful issue.
Yeah, where you see adult Pete, right, in Smallville. And so he's become an engineer himself at this point.
A rich geologist, Anthony. A rich one.
Correct,
yes. He came up in another story as well.
And here you have Pete, like, once again, looking out for Clark. Even though Jonathan and Martha are long gone, Clark has maintained the house, right? And Pete surmises that Clark's doing this because he's afraid of anyone else coming in and discovering his secret somehow, that maybe something was left behind, something would give it away.
Yeah.
But so he comes up with this way to sort of ease Clark's burden, right? They're going to build a highway like right over that spot. So the house is going to be demolished. And so he thinks he's doing a good thing for Clark, right? But it turns out Clark has been keeping the house primarily out of sentimentality, right? As this attachment to his past. And Pete realizes
he sorted everything out.
Yeah.
The robots have gone, all the souvenirs have gone. But yeah. Although, as it turns out, we found out a little bit later that there was one Superboy robot that was being the secret guardian of Smallville for all those years. And I think Pete also appeared in that issue. But yeah, it was just brilliant to see Pete still being, as you say, Superboy's best friend, Superman's best friend, even though he didn't know it. And it was fun to see him actually, grown up with mutton chops.
Yeah. And then we've been mentioning John Ross, Pete's son. So this was one of the things I had asked you. It's like, and I guess we have our answer. Like, we never see who Pete Ross marries. We never see him get married. We never see him have a kid, right? Like, it's just all of a sudden in, Action 457 in 1976, he has a son, right?
Yeah. It's not even like in those imaginary Super Son stories where you see them in shade. The wives are in shade. Who they are, we don't know, but they're in shade and they're wearing hats. It's like there's no mention that there was a divorce. There was no mention that she's died. It's just, I mean, and he looks so much like Pete Ross. He might well be, he could have cloned him. I would have believed it if he'd said it was a Pete Ross mini-me clone. Very odd. I mean, it would have taken Elliot Magan or Carrie Bates, whoever wrote those issues, one line to say, or your mother's away, or she's dead, or whatever, just something. Questions are big.
You don't even need that much. Like we're saying, a panel, a line. It's kind of shocking to me that two huge developments, right? Getting married, having a child for Pete are just completely skipped over and not like now. Yeah. And it's funny too, because looking again on Wikipedia, especially, there are references to Pete being widowed, but didn't find that in these few
I didn't
issues.
find that anywhere either. No.
So I mean,
making that up.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, unless there was some line in some issue that we missed, but yeah, I mean, it's based
unless
on.
It was in, maybe it was E. Nelson Bridwell answering a letter, but if it's not in the comics, nah, not true.
Yeah, I agree. So I mean, talk about another injustice. I mean, really skipping over a huge stretch of this guy's life here. And then you were getting at this before, but yeah, this John Ross issue was bonkers. This kid, you like you said, it's quite the particular affliction. He's lost the will to survive. The only thing that will save him is if Superman reveals his secret identity. Okay, no, I don't get this.
Yeah, and the irony is, his dad could have told him, but I don't think that even comes up in the story. That or it doesn't come up whether or not Peter's tried to tell him himself. It's just Superman's got to reveal himself. It's bizarre.
Very odd. And then, moving forward here towards the late 70s, I mean, we've already been talking about this, but this two-parter in DC Comics Presents numbers 13 and 14, written by Paul Levitz, where John Ross is taken by this alien race. He's meant to be this intergalactic warrior. The Legion's involved. Superman does try to save him, but ultimately the takeaway is he can't interfere with destiny. And this is the issue where we finally get that moment of Pete going to Clark, ripping open Clark's shirt, like, I know you're Superman. I need you to do this. And swears at the end of the issue that Clark will pay for failing to save John.
Yeah, I do not blame him.
I don't blame him. And then in the very next issue, Clark gets attacked by none other than Superboy. Right. And so you find out over the course of the story that Pete used a time machine and a mind transference machine and was able to pull Superboy to the present. And before we ran into that business about you can't have the same person occupying the same point in time.
Yep.
Before that, Pete was able to transfer his mind into Superboy's body and vice versa. And they duke it out.
Yep, so they circumvented it.
Yeah. And then ultimately we have Crypto to the rescue, which I thought was great. But I mean, it ends, really, I guess this is the other thing that really bums me out about this story is that, we understand where Pete is coming from, but he goes so dark so fast. If we were going to go down this road with him, I wish this could have been able to breathe a bit more, because it just feels like it's just so abrupt.
It was madness. It's to think that they obviously did. They obviously intended that to be the end of the storyline, and John would grow up to be a great hero in another world. It's like, nah, no, and it made the Legion of Superheroes look like total. I'm not saying that just because it was in their history books. Not one of them, I think 4 or 5 came back. Not one of them had a bit of sympathy to say, maybe we could try and change things ourselves. It's just terrible, and it honestly still makes me very annoyed, the whole storyline.
Yeah. So I don't know, looking at the Bronze Age, I mean, the fact that, his marriage, the birth of his son is skipped over entirely. And then this villainous turn, Superman failing to save John, and then getting killed in whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow off panel. I feel like the Bronze Age, not particularly kind, to Pete Ross. And then we get into the post-crisis era, and I kind of ran through a lot of this already, so we can just kind of jump around if there's anything we didn't really fully unpack. But
yeah.
I think overall, this kind of speaks to, when we talk about the John Byrne reboot of the character, this reinvention, Clark was no longer Superboy. Now look, on the Smallville TV show, Clark wasn't Superboy, but we spent a lot of time in Smallville, and that created a place for Pete. But I think what you see here is not only is Clark not Superboy, but we're only in Smallville for a specific, discrete amount of time. Not unlike Superman the movie. I feel like we were really kind of boiling down the Smallville piece to what we get. And so Pete's not in the Man of Steel miniseries. He doesn't debut in the post-crisis comics until a little while later. I guess the big picture question that I guess I have for you about this post-crisis era. To borrow a phrase from our pal in podcasting, Michael Bailey, from crisis to crisis, right? From the Man of Steel reboot through the Infinite Crisis period. I mean, as someone who had this knowledge of Pete Ross and this affinity for the pre-crisis version of Pete Ross, I mean, during this period of time, I mean, how did you feel the fact that whole aspect of his character, knowing Clark's secret and guarding it silently, was stripped away? What did you make of that at the time?
Well, it was just seemed such a waste because his unique selling point was just totally gone. I mean, okay, Clark hadn't been Superboy in costume, but he could still have discovered the secret because obviously Lana knew about the powers eventually. Well, late teenage years, Pete could have discovered the secret years previously and been enabling Clark to go about his business to help in whatever small way. But as it was, he just became another Townie. I think was he referencing the Millennium storyline as one of the Smallville people who'd wandered around the world because of this plot line that was just bonkers and we shouldn't go into. But yeah, so it was Pete lost. The point of Pete was lost. That he was Clark's really, really good pal. He just became the person who would pop up as an adult and be slotted into storylines. I mean, as we know, the Peter's presidential candidate didn't work for me quite as well as it worked for your good self. But I can see why it worked for you and why it didn't work for me. But it just seemed like Pete was just there again and again to be a dupe. I mean, he was there getting played by, well, Lex wanted him to be his running candidate to play the people of the countryside, the rural areas, to make them think Lex would do things for him. And perhaps Lex did. But Pete was being duped by Lex. And then he was, Lana's second best. And then he got to be the second best president. And his dream, obviously, a Man for All Seasons was plugged into continuity pretty quickly. And so we saw he'd had these dreams of leaving Smallville and becoming something big. But when he did become something big, it was a failure. And it led to the end of his relationship with Lana. Every time Pete turned up, it just seemed quite sad.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't disagree. I think one of the biggest showcases we get for him is, this was a running thread for a while, but it really culminates in this 3-issue swing during the early Triangle era: Superman 69, Action 679, and Adventures 492. When Pete, he's become a senator, he's succeeded another senator who was killed. And so he takes his place, and then he ends up being manipulated, or they try to manipulate him. The Sons of Liberty, right? He gets caught up in this Sons of Liberty business, this shadow government that's pulling all these strings, and they kidnap Lana, and they force Pete to bring a gun in his briefcase into this Senate hearing.
Shocking stuff,
right? To kill a witness who's going to testify against the Sons of Liberty, and Pete can't. He brings the gun in, but he can't bring himself to actually take it out and use it. But then they had another agent as a backup who steps in and takes the gun. And so Pete still gets in hot water for bringing the gun.
He ends up in jail, doesn't he, for a bit?
Yeah, and he has interaction with Superman, and he's still fearing for Lana's safety, so he can't reveal what's going on. I mean, I feel like out of all of these post-crisis stories, as much as, yes, he has other things to do and he pops up, but I feel like these few issues, it's like where he has the most, and it's the most about him.
Yeah, no. Again, he's just getting used as a dupe. God bless him for trying to plug Pete into a storyline and give him a part in a dramatic narrative piece. But he just really never gets to be the person it's about. I mean, he's quite heroic in that he does refuse to use the gun in the end. I just would just like a sustained period of happiness for Pete.
Yeah, I know. And I guess another kind of spotlight moment for him is in the Dan Jurgens written and drawn miniseries, Superman: The Doomsday Wars. That's where you have Brainiac taking over the body of Doomsday. Yep. And this is also the story that sees the birth of Pete and Lana's son.
Baby Clark.
Yeah. And, this one is particularly interesting. I feel like this really drives home this tension that exists in the Pete-Lana relationship and their friendship with Clark, because there's a car accident and the baby is born prematurely and is in very critical condition. And in the hospital, like, Lana is calling for Clark, right? Like, Lana needs Clark there.
She kicks Pete out of the room, doesn't she? So she can talk to Clark and ask Clark to go and help, put the little baby in this pot and carry him to another hospital or whatever. It's just, at that point, the two of them just tell Pete, for goodness sake.
So a couple of things about Doomsday Wars. One, it was an interesting echo, conscious or otherwise. I don't know if Jurgens was necessarily explicitly thinking of the DC Comics Presents storyline, but there are definitely echoes, intended or otherwise, when Superman intervenes. He's transporting the baby, but then Doomsday attacks, and Doomsday takes the baby because basically Brainiac needs a new body, because Doomsday is going to reject Brainiac at a certain point. So Doomsday needs a new body, and so he's going to grow the baby and inhabit the body. That's the whole thing. But you get this altercation then between Pete and Superman, right? Where at this point, Doomsday's taking the baby, as far as they know, the baby's dead. And Pete's like really in Superman's face, and you feel that anger. Like it felt like an echo of that DC Comics Presents storyline.
I think that's absolutely fair comment. And then I mean, Dan Jurgens is totally the right age to have been reading those DC Comics Presents stories. But I'm not a big fan of sort of putting the babies in danger, like like in the Flash movie or something else,
or the new Superman movie, or the new Fantastic Four movie, or yeah.
to a little Joey Metamorpho. but yeah, it was good for drama. But I mean, I must admit, when I was looking at that again, I was just skipping. I'm so doomsdayed out.
Yeah, no, I understand, but I agree with you. This is my other big takeaway. At this point in time, I think it's really I think Clark is really doing a disservice to both Lana and Pete by not sharing the secret. I mean,
well, he's told all these. Every time a hero joins the Justice League or something, he's telling them his identity, and he might never have met them.
Well, that's the thing. I've talked about this in the past. Like I remember talking about my era of really coming up in comics. Like there was a whole thing in Mark Waid's JLA run where the members of the team reveal their secret identities to each other, and it was like a big deal. Then just a few years later in Brad Meltzer's Identity Crisis, and I liked this aspect of it, that you really felt the superhero community that existed. But through that story, it's like everybody and their spouse knows each other's secret identity. And I just felt like, okay, it just felt divorced from kind of what I had been reading not too long earlier. But kind of, especially with that in mind, right? That, you have spouses of superheroes who are in on this. It's like, why could Pete not be told that Clark is Superman? And I just feel like Clark is putting, if Lana's his best friend, as I said so many times, it's like, he's really putting her in an impossible situation to be married, right, to Pete, to not tell him. And it's like, obviously there was this romantic past with Clark and Lana. And the thing is, it's like Pete is correctly picking up on the fact that there is something between Clark and Lana. And it's
absolutely
totally reasonable for him to think it's these unrequited, unresolved feelings, when arguably maybe that's still going on from Lana's side. But even putting that aside, it's the secret. I just feel like it was totally unfair for Clark to expect Lana to maintain that secret in marriage.
Of course, it is just putting a barrier between them. Friendship, sense, trying to keep a marriage on the go. You tell him.
Yeah. And I mean, I think like that story in particular, and look, I don't know, maybe Jurgens wanted to do that and DC said no. Like I'm not pinning this on him particularly, but I just feel like that story especially would have been a keen opportunity for Clark to finally say, listen, Pete, I should have told you this a long time ago. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right.
We've got a lovely scene. And, we've got new storylines out of it as well.
And it also would have made a lot more sense than why they named their baby Clark. I feel like that would have really been a nice moment of resolution and moving forward. So yeah, I'm glad that Pete got as much spotlight in that story as he did. And there's a whole framing device, this flashback to Clark and Pete and Lana and this horrible blizzard in Smallville and the Kent farm, and all the cattle died and the farm was almost lost and the town rallied around them. So there's some really good stuff for that trio and Pete in particular in that story. But yeah, I feel like that would have been the time for him to know.
Absolutely. There should have been the Three Musketeers. They know his identity, they're good pals, and that's it. No secrets between them.
We've been talking about him becoming Lex's VP. There's one page that really went a long way for me in Superman 162. This is when Pete is announced as the VP, and then Clark goes to Smallville and essentially says, like, what are you doing?
And yeah, he just flies there. He's watching it on the TV. And he just zooms straight there.
Yeah, but there's this great moment, and written by Loeb, and it's this great callback to For All Seasons, because Pete puts his hand on the elephant's head. And he's like, remember, I always used to wish for $1 million, and then I thought it was childish. He's like, I didn't give up on the $1 million. I gave up on the wishing. I gave up on myself. I think Lex is going to win, and I'm going to be a winner now too. That was just the one page. I wanted a lot more from Pete during the whole campaign presidency storyline, but that went a long way. And I think did kind of also tie into this whole like George Bailey of Smallville idea and like these grander aspirations that he had.
You can't see it through line.
There's a lost President Pete story from Superman Secret Files 2009. So this was a year. So this is in the post-Infinite Crisis landscape. But it's 3 pages. And yeah, basically, Pete is like inadvertently signing off on paperwork that will play into the new Krypton business. I forget offhand.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah.
I could not remember.
I forget exactly what it was, but it's one of those things where, and maybe this is another instance, tying into my larger thesis, it's like they didn't want to make Pete a bad guy, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like the stronger story would have been if he's like, you know what, we have to protect the world, we protect the country from Superman, from the Kryptonians, like whatever it is. I'm going to, otherwise you just make him look like he's signing stuff. He doesn't know what he's doing.
A total eye off the ball. You know, what's going on, Peter?
Yeah. And then the last like big bit of business, which we've already hit on, is when you have this new villain, Ruin, during the Greg Rucka run on Adventures of Superman.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, Ruin is unmasked and it's Pete. But then, of course, we find out he's been set up by Professor Emil Hamilton. But, you know, I feel like this is something that really kind of gets lost in the shuffle because it's so brief and it's so close to a huge crisis event. But we find out in these issues that Lex, who knows Clark's secret at this point in time, shared the knowledge with Pete.
Yeah, that was interesting. It was, and Pete had been sitting on it and, you know, finally confronts Clark with it. And I don't think it really ever goes anywhere again, does it, particularly?
No, I mean, not really, because, you know, we get the flashback. We see that he learns the secret. There's a bit where Pete is locked up and I think he goes as Clark, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, he goes as Clark to talk to him, and you know, they're being surveilled, so he can't really say too much, but he whispers to Clark that he knows his secret. But that's a relatively brief scene. And then, no joke, there's like a 1-page wrap up at the end of the storyline where Superman and Pete and Lana are there together talking, right? And there's this, and this is as Lana's in the process of divorcing Pete and all of that. But there's, you know, kind of a nice moment with them on the rooftop, but it's all of a page, you know? And then we're into the post-Infinite Crisis landscape where Pete and Lana have divorced and he's gone back to Smallville. We see him in Blackest Night, Superman #1, running the general store. So the former president now is running the general store.
But it is a shame, though, because to go back to after that, at the end of the Ruin storyline, there's a little bit of hope, you know, that from what Lana says and things, that they might be able to get, you know, look back at the relationship again. But then, as you say, a few months later, she turns up, they're divorced.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, you talk about another kind of injustice for Pete, but it's like during the later Joe Kelly issues on Action Comics, and then very much in the Chuck Austin run on Action Comics,
oh dear.
You know, we've really had this turn with Lana where she explicitly says in one of those, it's the Lost Hearts storyline that Joe Kelly wrote with Jeff Johns, where she literally has a line about like, I'm tired of settling for second in
yes,
you know,
awful. That's when she's not hiding her knickers in Lois's laundry basket.
Yeah, and then that comes in the Chuck Austin. So, you know, that's the other thing too. I mean, I think throughout the Pete Lana relationship in the post-crisis era, you know, look, I think there's a fair question about whether and to what extent Lana has truly moved on from Clark and is truly all in on Pete. But I think until we get to these later storylines, I think there's enough of a case that, you know, they're together, they're in this together. But, you know, certainly by the point of that Chuck Austin run, I mean, you know, Lana's really had this turn, and unfortunately it I think does a disservice to Pete.
That never happened. Screw Lana. There's not a way in the world that was Lana Lang. Absolute madness.
But yeah, then we see him running the general store in Blackest Night Superman. In the Jeff Lemire Superboy series, he officiates the Superboy Kid Flash race.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, Zoom.
And he's like, I'm Pete Ross, here on behalf of Smallville High. In what capacity? As an alum? As a teacher? As a principal? I have no idea. Like, I don't know what the intention was.
No. I mean, yeah, no one bothered to ask, you know, what he's done, what he's doing. Is, you know, editor? Come on.
You know, and you know, here's the other interesting thing too. It's like, you know, in that post-Infinite Crisis landscape, you get so few appearances. I mean, does he still know that Clark is Superman? You know, what happened at the end of that Ruin storyline right before Infinite Crisis, is that intact? Like, I honestly don't know.
Absolutely, because I was surprised as you to see him pop up again recently. So you don't know what's intact and what's not. I mean, it's such a blur. I mean, we know that a lot of the triangle era history came back in play when the two Supermen merged, but it's not that clear. I wouldn't have I wouldn't imagine the new history of the DC universe will have room to tell us anything about that. So hopefully it'll just all be revealed as we go along.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued in terms of the ongoing Superman books. Josh Williamson on Superman, Wade telling his Superboy stories, Dan Slott, Superman Unlimited. The fact that Pete is seemingly back in play in both the past and the present. Like, I'm really curious how they'll play this, and if there will be any acknowledgement of that ruin finale where he learned the secret. I mean, I don't know. It could go either way because we've had so many crises since then. So they could have wiped that away, or it could be intact. Like, I don't know. But it's just like this long stretch now where there's just these very, very fleeting appearances. I mean, I know, in the New 52, I remember one of those Action Comics backup stories where Pete and Lana are helping Clark, pack up the house and leave. But again, very fleeting. I mean, I don't know offhand other instances of him in the New 52. I don't know that there were many, if any.
I can't remember anything of Pete Ross in the New 52. The only blonde guy I remember in the New 52 was that Jonathan chap that Lois was dating for a while. It just vanished.
Yeah.
never to be heard of again. But no, I mean, I would just love something to happen. I want Pete to meet a nice lady. I mean, I can only think of one other named female apart from Lana Lang in Smallville history, and that was Lisa. The New Adventures of Superboy that Clark was dating. So perhaps Mark Waid could exhume her.
Oh, that would be great, because that was such a dangling thread right at the end of that New Adventures of Superboy series. Like, we're finally getting some movement. He had this girl, Lisa. Yeah. Oh, man, that would be great. That would be a great pull.
I really do hope that, obviously Mark Waid has plans to feature Pete at least as a regular in the comic and in Action Comics. But I really do want to see something of Pete in the modern set book, because I mean, I'm enjoying especially the Williamson Superman book hugely. But if I had any quibble, well, I always have quibbles. I'm like that, but it would be that we just don't see enough of the Daily Planet Office, the Private Life of Clark Kent, etc. And I like this. We saw Pete at the wedding at the Summer of Superman, so let's see something of what you were suggesting of seeing Pete and Clark having chats in Smallville, because Pete's out there. He's never been used to his full potential, I don't think. And okay, it's late in the day, but let's see something nice, something good, and something nice and impactful that will last done with Pete Ross.
Amen. I mean, I think the last thing I'll say, like, kind of in my ideal scenario, I really do like this idea of him being the silent protector of the secret to a point. I think there needs to be a payoff after a while. And I don't think it's a villainous turn. I don't think that's like the best track for the character, but I do think a place of honesty between Clark and Pete where they can have those honest conversations as true pals, I think is the way to go. I really do see Pete as this kind of Smallville stalwart and kind of being like I said, the mayor of Smallville, literally or figuratively. I would take either. He could be the actual mayor, or just kind of
honestly. I love that
representation. And the last thing, lest anyone think that I'm like, oh, you got to have Pete in every issue. No, I don't expect that. We don't see the Kents every issue. We only see Lana.
We don't see Lois in every issue.
Yeah, that's the thing. But I think, periodically to have those moments and really make them count. And I mean, I would love, and I feel like the Wade action run could be a great vehicle for this, but I would just love an issue that's all from his perspective. I just think that would be great.
Please.
And that would go such a long way, right? So like I said, I think, kind of using Pete strategically. I mean, hell, even going back to the Smallville TV show, maybe Pete shouldn't have been a series regular. Maybe he should have been a recurring guest star. And it's like, when he's there, you really used him a lot and used him well, as opposed to him just kind of always being floating around. So, strategic, but impactful uses of the character. That's what I'd love.
Fingers crossed. I mean, I would love to hear what other people's experience and thoughts on Pete Ross is, because it can't be just us, Anthony. It can't be.
Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad we got to do this.
It's been absolutely fantastic chatting to you. Thank you. And justice for Pete Ross.
Justice for Pete Ross. I hope we've delivered it. But thank you, Martin. Thank you, audience. Make sure you keep tuning in. Until then, as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. Support the show and receive exclusive content, including the spin-off podcast Beyond Metropolis, advanced listens, and more, by becoming a member at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. My sincere thanks to all patrons. Subscribe, rate, and review today via your platform of choice, and continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Links are in the show notes. Flat Squirrel Podcast is also home to another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman. now covering the color era of the classic George Reeves series. Subscribe today.